Good evening, and welcome to the late night hour. I'm Visage, and you're tuning into my late night show, where the night is ours to explore. Whether you're winding down or just getting started, I'm here to keep you company in the stillness of the dark. Tonight, I have an intriguing story to share, one that weaves tension and mystery, or leaves you curious about what lurks in the shadows. If you have a story of your own, send it my way, and I'll read it for you. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's venture into the enchanting unknown together. Let's begin, shall we? The exit on the right. Moving into a new apartment had always felt like a necessary evil. As a nurse, I'd lived all over, one cramped, impersonal place after another, constantly on the move. So when I found a reasonably priced apartment in an older building on the quieter side of town, I didn't hesitate. The idea of finally having some stability, a place I could at least pretend was home, was too tempting to pass up. The landlord, a tall, slightly balding man in his 50s, named Gerard, greeted me when I arrived to sign the lease. He had a certain warmth about him, a well-practiced friendliness that made me feel welcome right away. "You like it here," he said, smiling as we walked through the building's creaky halls. "The neighbors are good folks. Mrs. Klein, the baker, lives across from you. You'll smell cinnamon buns at least twice a week. And Mr. Peterson, down the hall, keeps to himself, but he's lived here forever." The building itself was old but charming. Wooden floors that creaked with character, walls adorned with faded floor wallpaper, and a grand staircase that curved around the entryway like something out of an old photograph. It felt lived in, worn in all the right ways. I'd moved enough times to know this place wasn't glamorous, but it had something many places didn't, a sense of history. Mr. Gerard showed me to the apartment. "Everything's pretty straightforward," he said, flipping through keys on a heavy ring. "Laundry's in the basement, trash chews down the hall, and, well," he hesitated for a moment as we reached the far end of the hallway. "One more thing." I followed his gaze to the door at the very end, a plain, nondescript door. The paint was chipping a bit around the edges, and the metal number affixed to it was faded. Unremarkable, except for the way Mr. Gerard seemed to avoid looking directly at it. "The door," he quietly said, "used to lead to the old exit stairwell, back before they renovated. It's sealed off now, though. The new exit's on the opposite side of the building. We never could remove the old stairwell, so we just locked the door and built the new one." There was something about the way he said it, something in the way his usually warm expression grew colder, more distant. "Sealed?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, it's locked up tight. No one goes in there." His voice was matter of fact, but I sensed something unsaid beneath it, like he wasn't telling me the whole story. It wasn't my business though, and I didn't press him. I had bigger things to worry about. Between the night shifts at the hospital and trying to settle into my new place, the locked door didn't seem like it should be at the top of my list. But it was always there, a quiet presence at the end of the hallway. The last door on the right. Something about it gnawed at the back of my mind as the days went on. It wasn't like the door ever moved or opened. It stayed shut, just as Mr. Gerard has said. But every time I passed by, there was a strange feeling, an uneasy sensation like being watched. Like the door wasn't just part of the building, but something more. The feeling lingered, but ignored it. I had work, and I was too exhausted most days to think much of it. After long shifts, I've come home, eat something quick, and collapse onto my bed. But the nightmare started not long after I settled in. Dark, twisted dreams of smoke and fire, of children's voices crying for help. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, with the smell of something burning still clinging to my nostrils. It was too vivid, too real. One night, after a especially brutal shift, I came home late. The hallways eerily quiet. I was almost at my door when I noticed something strange. The door, the last door on the right, was ajar. Just a crack, but unmistakably open. I froze, the fatigue in my bones turning to ice. The door was supposed to be sealed, locked, inaccessible. But there it was, a sliver of darkness spilling out from behind it. I took a step closer. That's when I heard it, a soft, distant sound. A child's voice? Mama. My heart stopped. I blinked, straining to hear over the rush of blood in my ears. The voice was faint, almost like it was coming from deep within the stairwell, beyond the door. A soft sob, trembling, full of fear. I stood there for what felt like eternity, torn between instinct and logic. I was a nurse, trained to help, to run toward danger when someone needed it, needed me. But this felt different. Every instinct told me to turn away, to close the door and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But the crying continued, that small, pitiful voice tugging at my heart. I had to know. Hello? I called out softly, my voice barely louder than a whisper. I took another step toward, pushing the door open just enough to peer inside. The darkness seemed to swallow the light from the hallway, and the air coming from within was colder than it should have been, damp, stale. Then I heard it again. Mama, please. My pulse quickened. I stepped through the door down into the stairwell. The smell hit me immediately. Charred wood, like something had burned long ago and never fully faded. The walls were dark, covered in soot, as though they'd once been scorched by flames. My footsteps echoed in the narrow space as I descended, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The crying grew louder, more frantic. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them. Children. More than one now. Their voices overlapping, calling out in anguish. I stopped halfway down, the weight of dread settling on my chest. The air was thick, heavy, was something I couldn't quite place. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing, distorting. I felt dizzy, disoriented, like I was sinking into something far darker than just a forgotten stairwell. That's when I saw them. At the bottom of the stairs, barely illuminated by the faint light filtering through the cracks in the wall, stood a group of children. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and hollow. Their clothes were tattered, burned at the edges. Their skin was blistered, scorched. The sight of them made my stomach churn. "We couldn't get out," one of them whispered. A little girl with hair matted to her face. Her voice was soft, barely more than a breath. "The door wouldn't open." I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't understand. What happened?" "The fire," another child said, his voice empty as if the motion had long since been burned away. "We tried to leave, but it wouldn't let us." A low, guttural sound filled the air, and suddenly the temperature dropped. The stairwell shook, the walls vibrating with a force that made the whole structure groan. I turned, bolting up the stairs, my heart racing in my chest as the children's voices rose behind me, their cries echoing louder and louder. "Don't leave us." I reached the top and slammed the door behind me, gasping for breath, the hallway spinning around me. For a moment, everything was still. The door stood shut, just as it always had. No sound, no children. I stumbled back to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and collapsed onto the floor. Was it a hallucination? Exhaustion? Or was there something worse? That night, I called the police. They were dismissive, bogged down with citywide protests, and short staffed. They promised they would send someone eventually, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going back. The next day, I went straight to Mr. Gerard's office. I had to know. When I told him what I've seen, his face went pale. The cheerful landlord I met on day one was gone. In his place was a man burdened by a deep, gnawing guilt. "I hoped it wouldn't happen again," he said quietly, his voice heavy. "I hoped it would stay quiet." I frowned. "You knew?" He nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "I didn't always own this place. I grew up here. My family. They were here the night of the fire." I stared at him, the pieces slowly falling into place. "We lived on the top floor," he continued. "When the fire broke out, we tried to escape down the old stairwell, but the door wouldn't open. We were trapped. My parents, my sister, they didn't make it." His voice trembled, and for the first time, I saw the deep sadness in his eyes. "I was the only one who survived. I don't know how, but I lived with the guilt ever since." He swallowed hard, rubbing his temples. "When I became the landlord, I sealed the stairwell. I tried to make sure no one would ever have to go through what we did. But those kids, the ones you saw, they were trapped there too. They never got out." I sat there in stunned silence, my heart aching for those lost souls. The children, their voices, their cries for help, they weren't just echoes of the past. They were still there, trapped in that stairwell, reliving that final moment over and over again. And no matter how many doors were sealed, no matter how many walls were built, that place would never truly let go of its ghosts. After that, I couldn't stay. I packed up and left. But even as I drove away, I could still hear them, soft, distant voices, calling out from behind the last door on the right. And I knew they always would.